Good evening, everyone. I'm Erin Monroe, the Robert H. Schutz Jr. Associate Curator of American Paintings and Sculpture. And tonight's program is hosted by the Wadsworth Atheneum, Museum of Art in Hartford, Connecticut, and has been generously supported by the Joseph and Robert Cornell Memorial Fund. New York in the 1920s, art architecture in the city is inspired by the current exhibition, Paul Manship, Ancient Made Modern, an exploration of the celebrated early 20th century sculptor Paul Manship, best known for public commissions such as Prometheus at Rockefeller Center in Manhattan. But this exhibition draws together several works of art by Manship, ranging from bronzes, sketches, and his drawings, as well as ancient art that inspired him. Also on view at the museum is a dialogue of three printmakers, Francisco Goya, Jose Guadalupe Posada, and Enrique Chagoya, as well as Milton Avery, the Connecticut Years. Next week, the museum will open a large-scale installation on our front lawn by the installation artist Leonardo Drew. We are open to the public, Fridays 12 to 8, Saturdays, Sundays 12 to 5. Please visit our website and follow us on social media to learn more about current exhibitions, programs, and to stay current with our visiting hours and regulations. I will say it's an honor to have Professor Fenske here and to add context to the Paul Manship exhibition and his era. That show runs until July 3rd, so please make arrangements to come see it before it's too late. Now over to Jana Israel to introduce our speaker.
Well, thank you, Erin, and thank you to everyone for joining us tonight. I mentioned in the chat box that you should please check the museum's website for more information about the Paul Manship exhibition and about visiting the museum in general. So Professor Gail Fenske is one of the leading experts on skyscrapers. She is the author of The Skyscraper in the City, The Woolworth Building and the Making of Modern New York, and she is co-editor of Alto and America. She has contributed several essays to books, among them Skyscraper Gothic, The American Skyscraper, Cultural Histories, and The Landscape of Modernity. She is professor of architecture in the School of Architecture, Art, and Historic Preservation at Roger Williams University. And she has held teaching positions at Cornell University, Wellesley, and the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, where she also received her PhD. Professor Fenske is also a licensed and practicing architect in Boston, and she is the perfect person to deliver tonight's lecture. So thank you so much for joining us, and I'll turn it over to Gail Fenske. Thank you.
Thank you, Jana, and Wadsworth Atheneum Museum of Art for inviting me to speak this evening on New York in the 1920s, and thank you everyone for attending. Rockefeller Center, its planning, architecture, and art, including Paul Manship's Prometheus, concluded an energetic decade of construction during the 1920s, when New York reached its apogee as the world's modern metropolis. Throughout the decade, architects, artists, and enlightened builders and patrons of the arts collaborated in the creation of a city at once modern, even dazzling, and visually delightful in works that celebrated the public experience of the city. How did it all come about? The towers of the city's midtown in the vicinity of Rockefeller Center served to define its new image with their pinnacled forms and ornate crests, later called Art Deco, most visibly here in the RCA building, the twin towers of the Waldorf Astoria Hotel, in the distance, the Chrysler Building, and then in the nearer view, Grand Central Station's office tower with its chateau-inspired roof. By the late 1920s, Midtown was widely known as the city's newest site of construction, and from the standpoint of public entertainment and the arts, its newest center of gravity. That is not to say that construction came to a halt downtown in the heart of the city's financial district. Throughout the 1920s, rival financial enterprises, here you're seeing One Wall Street and the City Service Company, engaged in an energetic competition for height, creating the towered and pinnacled skyline for which the city is also known. Behind the creation of these skylines and the 1920s modern metropolis, there existed a clear set of rules, defined with great precision in the zoning resolution of 1916. It contained two important components, use districts and height districts. The resolution's height districts, most important to the shaping, indeed the architectural quality and aesthetic character of the commercial city. The framers of the resolution had decided that they would govern with exacting dimensions. These prescribed setbacks, they prescribed an angle of light, with the twin aims of controlling the egregious speculative investment type of skyscraper and making the city's streets habitable, as well as dignified experientially for the city's sidewalk crowds. Behind the mathematics lay countless massing studies under the guidance of the Beaux-Arts architect George Burdett Ford. He literally envisioned through these studies, the future shape of the city. From the earliest stages of the construction following the new zoning law, Beaux-Arts architects took a guiding hand, committed to the future of the city. Harvey Wiley Corbett and Hugh Ferris collaborated to produce a visually compelling series of studies, showing their colleagues in the profession and others just what this future city might look like when shaped by the criteria of the law, delineating the masses of construction as if sculpting in clay. First, they illustrated the law's angle of light. Second, how the architect might bring in light to the habitable spaces within. Third, how those spaces might be dimensioned for the uses of offices or apartments. And fourth, how those dimensions would be constructed when framed in steel. In the face of controversy over the seemingly cold and mathematical architectural implications suggested by the new law, these architects advocated in their own drawings a source of inspiration for others, builders and architects alike. The first of the major skyscrapers to illustrate the implications of this new zoning law is Ralph Walger's Barclay Vesey Building for the New York Telephone Company, located on a site adjacent to the Hudson River, not far from the financial district downtown. Walker was asked to design a utilitarian building housing several floors of telephone equipment for the telephone company, not necessarily a monument, but still he gave it an identity as well as dignity with graceful and bold cubic setback proportions using flattened and abstracted piers with a new type of ornamental repertoire, highlighting, appropriately enough, advances in communication from ancient Babylon to the age of radio. The ornament of the grand east-west lobby featured a new decorative aesthetic, a beguiling, nature-inspired ornamental scheme with flattened and abstracted intertwining vines and trees in low relief, later called Art Deco. Closer to Midtown, the architect Raymond Hood took his cues from the new zoning law when designing the American Radiator Building, here showing a skyscraper stepping back as it rose to the sky, seeming to literally grow out of Manhattan soil and bedrock. The bedrock was a bit closer to the surface here, becoming lighter and more ethereal as the crest dissolved into the sky, suggesting in its pattern of ornamentation the glow of a torch in the night, alluding to the fire and warmth of the heating system so critical to the very life of the skyscraper. But Hood's design had another equally important source, the Finnish architect Eliel Saarinen's widely acclaimed second place competition entry for the Chicago Tribune Tower competition in 1922. Hood won the competition with a Gothic tower that featured soaring verticals inspired by the New York's Woolworth Building, along with the Butter Tower of the Cathedral of Rouen in France. In the eyes of the architectural profession, however, it was not Hood's design, but Saarinen's design that should have won. Hood's design, nonetheless, caught the eye of the artist Georgia O'Keeffe. O'Keeffe admired the modernity and the power of skyscrapers. In her mind, the new monuments of this new world, which rivaled those of the old. O'Keeffe depicted the Radiator Building abstractly, but also in a subtle, lyrical way. She made the skyscraper one of her key themes as a painter, having been drawn to the sense of limitless and aspiration it seemed to signify. Skyscrapers were at once tellingly American and distinctly modern, for O'Keeffe offering an answer to the question, what will the 20th century look like? O'Keeffe was part of the circle around Alfred Stieglitz's 291 Gallery, which through its exhibitions promoted New York over Paris as the new battleground of modern civilization, the avant-garde. In doing so, they glorified the skyscraper as the first artifact of American culture to attract sustained international attention, giving the city, unexpectedly, a new world identity. O'Keeffe watched the construction of the city's skyscrapers from the window of her apartment high in the 30th story of the Shelton Hotel. From this perspective, close to the top of the 33-story building, she experienced a sense of freedom, important to the modern artist, but especially she happened to be a woman. New York and its skyscrapers embodied for O'Keeffe the very experience of liberation and emancipation. She reasoned that the modern artist in New York must live at the very highest elevations in the heart of a roaring city, so that he had a place to behold the city before his eyes. She may well have been referring to Stieglitz, Alfred Stieglitz, to whom she married in 1924, and with whom she shared her apartment in the Shelton Hotel. O'Keeffe was also deeply impressed by the skyscraper's towering, even disorienting and destabilizing heights. Her Shelton with sunspots illustrates the power of the skyscraper's verticality, but revealingly, in her view, also shows as well the vulnerability of such a man-made structure in the face of nature. Nature's power she evokes with the drama of the sun, which not only steals our attention from the skyscraper itself, but also literally, as she put it, took a bite out of its side and sprinkled sunspots that photographers see when pointing a lens straight towards the sun. Not unlike O'Keeffe, Hugh Ferris found similarly high locations from which to view the city and to sketch his vision for its future. Ferris's Metropolis of Tomorrow showed the city constructed in accordance with the new zoning law, but also infused throughout its design with what he described as humanistic values in city planning, order, and harmony. What many viewed as the unpoetic reality of the law, Ferris continued to consider an opportunity. He identified the setback skyscrapers it described as the basis for an imaginary future metropolis, with buildings that rose like mountains out of the vast urban infrastructure of machinery below to step back and become more ethereal as they met the sky. Ferris's pyramidal clusters of towers, each of which took 4 city blocks and rose 1,000 feet high, he nonetheless organized along axes and cross-axes, wide avenues, planted squares, and lower perimeter blocks of construction, which spoke to the importance of the city's public spaces, along with their associated greenery and light and air. One of the important virtues of Ferris's design is that it illustrated the potentials of the zoning law's prescribed setbacks in creating terraces for living aloft. Immediately, he recognized their possibilities as elevated public spaces, offering light, gardens, and views, inspired by the day's popular imagery of ancient Babylonian hanging gardens, for instance, D.W. Griffith's Intolerance, the film that came out in 1916. And he asked how they might be put to public use, perhaps a mass ball atop some fine arts building, which he illustrated there. In the mid-1920s, construction in Midtown reached newly dazzling and competitive heights. During a spurt of activity surrounding the Grand Central Station, the Channing Building, commissioned by the builder Irwin Channing, who is a theatrical producer and founder of the Channing Construction Company in 1919, and designed by the architect Sloan and Robertson, took Saarman's Tribune Tower competition entry as a point of departure, but then rose to 56 stories and 680 feet high, setting a new record for the Midtown. The Channing's base served as a transportation node with a direct link to Grand Central Terminal and to the city's IRT subway line. Given its site at 3 intersecting height districts, 3 sets of rules determined by the zoning law controlled its setback design, it rose in the shape of a thin, tall, rectangular slab. The Channing is especially noted for its program of ornamentation. In the building's lower stories, above which extend buttresses that are in turn echoed in the crown, flattened tile cladding by Renee Chamberlain shows highly stylized floral motifs in terracotta, taking their inspiration from Paris's 1925 Exposition of Decorative Arts. And this is where we get the term Art Deco. This exposition of 1925 has been viewed and was at the time as the primary source for the wide array of the artistic crafted and ornamental forms that in the early 1960s received this descriptive term, Art Deco. When one considers the structures of this exposition and their ornamental patterns, all of which came from all places in the world and all times in history, among them African, pre-Columbian, and American indigenous cultures, along with those of European Cubism, German Expressionism, and the Vienna Secession, this makes sense, as designers had discovered what was considered at the time a wholly new, exciting, and exotic formal repertoire. But the sources for the imaginations of architects, decorative artists, and craftsmen extended still more broadly across the world of visuality that we associate with the 1920s, from film to the visual and popular graphic arts. Here, the set designers for Robert Vina's 1920 horror films, The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari and Genuine, took inspiration from the expressionist circle around the architect Bruno Taut, infusing their sets with emotive, even irrational qualities of tilting planes and angular lines. The influence of innovative filmmaking and set design, however, cut both ways. The Austrian filmmaker Fritz Lang, just as inspired by the city as O'Keeffe, having traveled to New York for the first time in 1924, where he photographed Broadway at night, and just as oriented towards discerning the city's future as Ferris, invented an equally compelling celluloid vision for that future, along with three architect set designers, Eric Kettelhut, Otto Hunte, and Karl Volbrecht. It showed an entire city rising like a mountain range, at the very pinnacle of which the Tower of Babel, a so-called temple of work, replaced the tower of the church. Lang's narrative centered on the character of Freder, his love for the working girl Maria, and the conflict with his father, Joe Fredersen, the almighty ruler of the huge metropolis, who oversaw armies of workers laboring underground like slaves at gigantic machines. Lang aimed to illustrate all at once the age's political conflicts, along with its hopes, fears, and European enthusiasm, perhaps questionable, for these American ways. But too often overlooked are the artistic sources closer to home, the artists at work in the studios of New York City. The German-American graphic artist and architect Winold Reiss focused on portraying the energy and excitement in the city's uptown, the Harlem Renaissance. Throughout the 1920s, Harlem thrived as a national center for the arts, music, especially jazz, theater, literature, and poetry, along with the visual arts. The musician, actor, and political activist Paul Robeson wrote that, well, the best way for African Americans to overcome racism was for their artists to succeed in a white-dominated culture, which they did, and which they had done by the mid-1920s, with musical performances on Broadway, the energetic nightlife in Harlem, and much more, in a golden age that set the stage for the later 1960s civil rights movement. The Russian avant-garde artist and socialist Louis Lozowick depicted New York, and they're on the right, and he infused it at the same time with the same energy and vitality in the play of architectonic geometries that we see in Rice's Harlem at night. Both pointed to the diversity of culture and people characteristic of the 1920s city. The Chrysler Building, well known by this time, is bound up with this filmic, theatrical, and artistic imagery, and still today is viewed as the classic Art Deco skyscraper. By contrast to the Channon Building, its massing is not a slab, but rather that of a tall, thin tower, rising out of a broad base and an ascending series of setbacks. When completed, it took the title of tallest in the world at 1,048 feet, surpassing the height of the Woolworth Building, the earlier record holder. The project had started out as a speculative office building, commissioned from the Beaux-Arts architect William Van Allen by the New York State Senator and builder of Coney Island's dreamland, William Reynolds. Reynolds hoped to build the world's tallest skyscraper. Van Allen produced his first design for Reynolds, but then at the spur of the moment, Reynolds sold the site and the design, indeed the entire project, to Walter Chrysler, chair of the Chrysler Automobile Corporation. Van Allen continued to revise the design under Chrysler's direction, focusing on the tower's pinnacle, which started out as a great jeweled sphere and ended up as a fantastic terraced dome with 7 concentric segments mounting one above another, and pierced with triangular windows to suggest the spokes of a wheel, all fabricated in the new stainless chrome nickel steel. Chrysler insisted on that, from which Van Allen would project what would become the legendary spire. The result was a fantastic iconography that related the skyscraper to the Chrysler Corporation and to the automobile. The theatricality of Van Allen's design fit in with the theatricality of the city, not only as shown by the nightlife of Harlem and film, but also in the great popular theatrical spectacles of Broadway, and even the cinematic novels of F. Scott Fitzgerald. This was especially evident in views of the Chrysler within its equally theatrical surroundings, here flanked by the towers of the RCA Victor Building and the Waldorf Astoria Hotel. The Chrysler's crest houses the original toolbox of Walter Chrysler, who started as a machinist working on the shop floor. In this sense, or in this design, there's a sense of spiritual transcendence about this man and his career. Even the smallest details of the building are incredibly, extraordinarily important, and many are direct references to Chrysler's principal product. In the frieze of the 30th story, a lone line of shiny Chrysler hubcaps speeds towards the corners, where winged hood ornaments and higher still heads in stainless steel, eagle heads in stainless steel take the place of Gothic gargoyles. Striations of black brick dematerialize the tower's corners with horizontals, while in abstract zigzag patterns suggest at once jazz and radio waves. The themes continue at the building's base. In an Egyptian entrance portal framed in black marble and stainless steel, and precision machine jazzy detailing that leads the sidewalk spectator inside. The critic, Douglas Haskell, accused Van Allen of stunts and effects, and Lewis Mumford of inane romanticism, but in fact, the 1920s was an age of great theatrical performances, and Van Allen was demonstrating the possibilities of architecture as a form of theater. The Chrysler's triangular lobby, a far cry from a conventional classical lobby, continued the theater inside. The quality of its craftsmanship and materials is outstanding, featuring Moroccan marble walls and yellow sienna marble floors. There's a direct link via stair to the IRT subway line and a concourse leading to the Grand Central Terminal. Looking upwards, the visitor finds an image of the skyscraper etched in the ceiling plane, and making their way to the 4 banks of high-speed elevators, the finest abstracted floral patterning and precision metalwork and a spectrum of exotic woods. After taking an elevator to the 66th floor, the visitor might ascend a polished marble-lined stair to the Cloud Club, a varied suite of rooms, or still more exciting, to the tower's observation gallery, where it was said that Van Allen outdid himself. Inspired by the German expressionist films, he treated the walls as a series of angular inward tilting planes, and above the dado painted fading sun rays and a star-studded nighttime sky that featured light fixtures as miniature Saturns. New York skyscrapers did engage in a popular form of urban theatrics designed to attract the attention of sidewalk crowds. And in the late 1920s, the highly competitive race for height reached a fever pitch. This was especially evident in a widely publicized rivalry, and this was journalists writing extensively about this, between H. Craig Severance and Yasuo Matsui's Bank of Manhattan Company building, which you see here, and William Van Allen's Chrysler Building. Severance and Van Allen were former partners in architectural practice. They split acrimoniously, and later each announced that he would be building the tallest skyscraper in the world. Their race for height was transformed via publicity into an extension of that earlier personal rivalry. As Van Allen was finalizing the details for the crown of the Chrysler Building, he reportedly heard that Severance had obtained a permit to add a lantern atop the 60 stories and 10 penthouses of his design, and for good measure, Severance was planning to add a 50-foot flagpole as well. But Van Allen, according to reporters, was not to be outdone. He designed a 185-foot stainless steel spire, which he hid within the crown's so-called fire shaft, and kept it secret until Severance topped off his design at 71 stories and 927 feet. Then, in a blaze of publicity, Van Allen watched as workers hoisted the spire into place. The signal was given, he recalled, and the spire gradually emerged from the top of the dome like a butterfly from its cocoon, and in about 90 minutes was securely riveted into position, the highest piece of stationary steel in the world, and that's 1,046 feet high. Severance, it was said, was aesthetically vanquished as well, and this was W. Parker Chase writing in New York, the Wonder City in 1932. Van Allen celebrated by dressing up like his building at the city's next Beaux-Arts ball, and his contemporaries called him the Ziegfeld of his profession. Severance's command of the lower Manhattan skyline with his Bank of Manhattan Company was short-lived. 2 years later, Clinton and Russell topped off the city's service building just after the completion of 2 additional rival towers, Citibank and Farmers Trust and One Wall Street, both completed in 1931. In addition to these 4 tallest spires, scores of major skyscrapers were built in the financial district south of Maiden Lane. Together, they transformed the lower Manhattan skyline, bringing attention to New York as a world center of finance, but also investing it with a new outcropping of pinnacles, each sporting a unique and memorable crest, an unforgettable city of towers. At the same time, skyscrapers continued to raise the ceiling of the Midtown, with the newest addition to the skyline being Raymond Hood's Daily News building there on the far right. Hood had developed a new idea for the massing of a tall building, persuading his newspaper client to erect less office space on the lower floors than the zoning code would allow, so that he could create a more dramatic architectural silhouette, not a tower, but almost a slab. Ever since his design for the Chicago Tribune Tower, Hood had continued to experiment with the language of verticals for skyscraper exteriors. Here he still further flattened and abstracted those verticals, making them Gothicized yet modern, creating a stark striped graphic effect with the verticals made of cream-colored glazed brick set off against russet-colored spandrels. So far in the 1920s, the simplest yet most radical treatment for a skyscraper's exterior elevations. Hood's curtain wall, like a slipcover, sheathed the steel-framed office interiors, designed throughout to a uniform depth of 27 feet. The slab dropped off in steps as it ascended in height, and also as the elevator core stepped back, given that fewer elevators were required to reach the highest floors. The design took on a new type of modern character. Hood was in dialogue with European architectural avant-garde. This would predict Hood's design for the RCA building at Rockefeller Center. Still, Hood had not forgotten the capacity of the skyscraper for urban theater. He exploited the newspaper's longstanding association with the world, given that as a mass medium, its role was to have its eyes constantly on the world. At the lobby center, he placed a huge revolving globe, half sunk into a recess in the floor and lit from below. He sheathed the lobby's walls with black glass, sloped them inward towards a faceted dome ceiling. Critics called out, yet once again, theatrical stunts and effects. Hood, I think, was taken more seriously in Midtown's most grandly scaled project, Rockefeller Center. He would assume a primary role in its design. Rockefeller Center site was vast in scale, covering several city blocks along Fifth Avenue between 48th and 51st Streets. It was an enlightened project from the start, showing concern for the city's public life and public domain. Its builders asked, can a group of skyscrapers be arranged in such a way to give something back to the city? The project had a complex development history. It was initially conceived as a home for the Metropolitan Opera Company, which aspired to construct a cultural center with a new opera house facing a spacious plaza to be designed by Benjamin Wistard Morris and surrounded by revenue-generating office buildings. But they struggled with how to offset the high cost of building the opera house, utilizing office construction to generate suitable profits. In December 1928, a new protagonist, John G. Rockefeller, entered the project scene. With Rockefeller's support, the Opera House formed the Metropolitan Square Corporation, and then Rockefeller brought in Todd, Robertson and Todd Engineering Corporation to study the project's speculative financing. He also appointed the Associated Architects, a team that included Raymond Hood, along with Harvey Wiley Corbett, both of whom were noted for their skyscrapers. Within 1 year, the stock market crashed, and in December 1929, the Metropolitan Opera abandoned the project. But by January 1930, Rockefeller's Associated Architects had proposed Scheme G3, which you see there on the right, with the aim of optimizing the use of the land. The plaza in front of the opera, they now conceived as an agora or forum, which they surrounded with 4 major skyscrapers. The drawings illustrating Scheme G3 show the center's most important organizational concept, the wide spacing of towers, combined with terrace roof gardens, all arranged around axes and cross axes following Beaux-Arts principles of design and showing a generosity of public space. As the design advanced, the architects and especially Hood continued to refine the terraces as elevated public spaces with sculpture gardens, outdoor theaters, greenhouses, and an elaborate system of stairs and mid-air bridges. Journalists described the project as a new Babylon and updated hanging gardens that was sure to appeal to the collective imagination as a civic attraction. Rockefeller attracted European investors in the project, as shown by the construction of the Maison Française and the British Empire buildings that would frame the center's main axis and set up the axial promenade to the RCA building. Throughout, architectural and economic studies had proceeded side by side. The RCA building, a dominant vertical marker, designed by Hood as a tall, exceedingly thin slab, replaced the Metropolitan Opera as the focal point of the project. At its base, the architects refined the Forum as the culminating experience of the axial promenade and the focal point for the entire project, with its placement right at the base of the RCA building, suggesting a powerful sense of release of space to the public domain. The quality of the Forum, now called Plaza, was important. It was to be the true focal point for the city's public life. And in doing so, Paul Manship's Prometheus served as a superb visual magnet attraction. It was expected that visitors, their eyes on Prometheus, would proceed down the center's axial promenade from Fifth Avenue toward the climatic verticality of the RCA building until they arrived to overlook the fountain and diners in the summer and skaters in the winter, all set against the United Nations parade of flags surrounding its rim. The axial promenade and the plaza on the ground, the gardens on the roofs, and the widely separated towers together proclaimed the spatial luxury of Rockefeller Center. But the hanging gardens of Babylon archetype was realized only in partial form. The bridges were costly and entailed extensive public design review, and without them, it was difficult to realize the gardens as truly public gardens. But still, fragments of the original vision remained, and the project nonetheless set a new standard for American city planning. Hood's design for the 70-story, 850-foot high RCA building, daringly thin, with sawn limestone verticals, not unlike those he had designed for the Daily News building, perfected his idea of the skyscraper as a slab. Rising like a sheer cliff, it gracefully eroded in setbacks, with a powerful sense of verticality, but an equally powerful quality of mass and weight. In the observation deck at the top of the slab, he aimed to recall the deck of an ocean liner. As if moving through the spectator, the city could feel the narrowness of the slab's dimensions while experiencing a wholly modern way of looking out at the world. The center's finest interior space was Radio City Music Hall, along with its foyer, which replaced the Metropolitan Opera with a new type of theater, that of mass entertainment and spectacle. The RKO Corporation, now part of RCA, lured the theater impresario Samuel Lionthal Rothafel, or Roxy, to manage the music hall. Roxy conceived and oversaw a theater larger than any movie palace, featuring performances that combined film with live musical numbers. Huge descending arches patterned after the sun rays cascaded towards the music hall's great stage. Roxy was seeking to achieve a unity between the audience and the performers within this single vast space. The foyer, a lofty space, had a magnificent sweeping stair that curved up to balcony overlooks, gold leaf ceilings and chandeliers like confections of frosted glass, and an enchanting garden mural comprising stylized flower shapes added to its decorous yet frivolous effect. For architectural critics, noted among them the modernist historian Siegfried Gideon, Rockefeller Center represented a tour de force and a standing reminder that the structure of the modern city must be transformed, not only for the sake of the individual, but for the sake of the community as a whole. Still, in New York, the competitive quest for height continued, most recently with the Noyes-Schultz Company proposing a 150-story super skyscraper to rise 1,600 feet on a two-block site at Broadway and Duane Street. The Empire State, though, in the end culminated the competition, surpassing the Chrysler to reach a height of 1,250 feet, and that includes its 200-foot high mooring mast, or 200-foot tall mooring mast, representing the most dramatic design as of yet for a skyscraper as an isolated tower. Extraordinary in its siting, standing wholly free in its surroundings at Fifth Avenue and 34th Street, far from the earlier cluster of skyscrapers grouped around Grand Central Station. From the start of the project, initially under the direction of Floyd Brown, speculative real estate economics governed all aspects of the design. Brown contracted to buy and demolish the Waldorf Astoria Hotel and to put up a mixed-use 50-story building, but he defaulted on his mortgage, and John J. Raskob, joined by the former governor of New York, Alfred E. Smith, stepped in to take it over. Raskob and Smith transformed the design into a major office tower, exploring along the way a number of financial alternatives for towers at 55 stories or 80 stories in height, following the now well-known financial formulas governing real estate finance, which for that site stipulated an economical height of 63 to at most 75 stories. In the end, however, Raskob and Smith decided on 80 stories, 1,050 feet without the mooring mast, knowing full well that the top 5 to 10 stories would be less than profitable, but also thoroughly understanding the advertising advantages of great height, and especially the advantage of surpassing the Chrysler in height, arguing that such a benefit, the highest in the world, made the uneconomical height worth the cost. The Empire State's construction, and in particular the speed of that construction, made the project spectacular. The entire project, from the architect's first sketches to the date of its completion, took a mere 20 months, with the steel frame averaging a story per day. With the stock market crash of October 1929, the proverbial phrase, "time is money," took on a new and special importance. Starrett Brothers and Aiken, the project's builder, employed the most advanced fabrication and erection techniques of the day, following the model of a Ford factory assembly line. High-strength steel, a total of 58,000 tons, fabricated in standardized dimensions to reduce the total number of framing members, especially the columns, along with pre-cut standardized limestone panels, chrome, nickel, and steel mullions, and cast aluminum spandrels and glass were all prefabricated in advance and systematically delivered to the site according to a precise schedule. It's called a vast scheduling job, the entire project. When the materials arrived on site, transported by 500 trucks a day, superintendents transferred them to elevators from which they rose vertically, and then they circulated them to the project's 3,000 workers throughout the site via railways to their designated places on each floor. To further increase speed, Starrett Brothers and Aiken located derricks on numerous setbacks to rapidly hoist the steel. Workers riveted in place 51,900 tons of structural steel within 6 months during 1930. The skyscraper's ceremonial topping off at the 86th story celebrated the structural ironworkers' all-important contribution to the project, particularly during the Depression, when they stood in line around the block, waiting for the opportunity to get the work. The photographer Lewis Hine documented the construction. For him, the workers who built the Empire State were no less than modern heroes. In his Men at Work, which contained over 1,000 images, he made it clear that these were men who it was a privilege to know, who had imprinted on the city its very character, and which they had, with their skills and their tools, helped to build. The completion of the Empire State compelled the film director, Marion C. Cooper, to tell the story of the great ape King Kong, captured against his will on his Skull Island mountaintop and brought to Manhattan Island, enslaved for show, but breaking free to climb to the top of the city's highest man-made mountain. In the film's culminating scene, pilots with their modern flying machines engaged in a fatal aerial attack. Just as compelling were the repeated attempts to dock a dirigible at the Empire State's mooring mast. It did happen just once for a mail delivery, which took 3 minutes in winds of 40 miles per hour. Later, the 800-foot-long German dirigible, the Hindenburg, flew by on its way to its dock in Lakehurst, New Jersey. And these were only a few of the stories and the scenes associated with the Empire State, which continues to hold a grip on the public imagination. Collectively, the skyscrapers, as designed, constructed, and interpreted and understood by artists, filmmakers, and photographers, had invested New York with a profound sense of place. This the architect Frank Lloyd Wright fully understood, even while he critiqued the skyscraper in his disappearing City of 1932, and he was one of the most vociferous critics of the skyscraper. He asked, pointing to the view of Lower Manhattan, which he illustrated in his book, "Find the citizen." He had already proposed his alternative to New York, his Broadacre City, a completely decentralized anti-city, a reaction to what he viewed as the evil ways of the city with its tyrannies of the skyscraper and centralized capitalism, Broadacre City would return its citizens to a pure, more natural state. Still, it's telling that Wright chose to unveil his plans for Broadacre City at Rockefeller Center in 1935. Even for him, the city had a profound sense of place, as it continued to do so with the construction, much later, of his Guggenheim Museum. Thank you.
Gail, thank you so much. That was wonderful. That was really a tour de force. I mean, you introduced us to the formal shape of the city, the materials, the new laws that were being shaped to accommodate all of the new technologies and capital investments that were taking place. And it was just really wonderful. And I think it sets a nice kind of backdrop to New York in relationship to the Paul Manship exhibition that Erin curated. And I don't know if Erin will join us in a moment. I have a question actually. Well, and then we'll get to a few other questions, but one of the things that I was curious about was you mentioned the zoning laws and the setback laws of 1916, I think. And those were actually for the form and elevations and the plans of the buildings. But actually, were there any new laws designated or devised to legislate the transport of materials into the city? Which, you know, you mentioned Georgia O'Keeffe looking out her window and watching the construction, which was very evocative. But this must have been a huge interruption into the life of the city that was already probably interrupted by cars and electricity and other infrastructure problems. So I was just wondering about the movement of materials into the city.
That's such an interesting question. You know, you hear again and again that the fact that the state, I mean, that the city was in a constant state of construction for some people was a little bit unnerving. It was sometimes a hard place to live. And I know that right around the turn of the century, the city as construction site was documented extensively by realist artists. But to answer your questions, about transportation of materials and what that entailed. It's interesting that I have not come across as of yet any specific legislation surrounding the timing of that, for instance. Not that it doesn't exist, but it's something that scholars haven't discussed, and I actually haven't seen any mention of it. It's an interesting question.
Well, why don't we move to some of the questions from attendees? So the first question that I see is, when were these skyscrapers occupied for profitability? When were skyscrapers first viewed as a way, as a method of speculation through which you could bring in people who wanted office space and make money, if I'm understanding that correctly? And that dates back to the very first skyscraper constructed, and it's the first corporate headquarters as well, constructed in 1873, and that's the Western Union Telegraph Building. From the beginning, that company, it's the first skyscraper. They had already set aside, it was between 2 and 4 floors, depending on their own varied needs, to rent out to people who were seeking office space. So, and then after that, the Tribune Building, the Tribune newspaper building, or skyscraper, the second skyscraper, or the second really tall building in Lower Manhattan, did the same thing, designating several floors as rental office space. So this idea that you attain height through speculating in real estate was there from the very origins of the skyscraper. Well, that's actually a nice point. So one question we have, are all the buildings you discussed still standing, or have any been replaced by even more towering buildings or skyscrapers? So, and then in parentheses, aside from the obvious famous sites, which I don't know if anything is ever obvious.
Yeah, that's a question that points to the history of constructing these buildings in New York. So many of them have been taken down, notably the Singer Tower, which you can see in the view, this last view of my presentation. It's got a wonderful mansard roof. that was demolished in 1968 for the United States Steel Building, which is this tall kind of rectilinear bronze and glass building, something very modern, very different than this kind of tower with a pinnacle that we see in the Singer. And that's just one instance. With regard to the first part of the question, my sense, I know, of course, the Empire State is, of course, still standing, but all of the skyscrapers I covered still exist. I may be forgetting something, but I don't think so. The Channon is still there, Chrysler, Empire State, the Barclay Veze, so these are all the kind of monuments. I chose the most well-known skyscrapers of the 1920s. And I think because they're so well-known, they truly are landmarks, and that's why they're still there. But that's not, to clarify that still further, this is as the question stated, besides the most well-known ones, there are many other skyscrapers, many other tall buildings that have been taken down and sites have been cleared. I mean, this idea of obsolescence, was there from the start, even right around the turn of the century. We see buildings being really tall buildings being taken down and new ones being put in their place.
Yeah, it's Erin. I have just a comment and then a question. I feel very grateful to have heard your talk because it does give architecture and architectural buildings, gives them personality, and they're otherwise deemed these kind of cool, I don't know, sort of neutral structures if you just sort of look at them as being highly symmetrical and geometric. So I love that there is not only personality, but real theatricality. I love that idea. So with the Paul Manship exhibition, I was really struck by his exterior panels for a corporate headquarters for the AT&T building in Lower Manhattan, which was, I think, designed in 1914. And he admitted that he was looking at this ancient tower in Athens, this Tower of the Winds. And I wondered, as much as all of the examples you show are strikingly new and innovative, is there any interest in ancient? I mean, obviously Greco-Roman architecture seeps in so many ways, but does anything come to mind?
When I kind of think right off about this, because I know the Tower of Winds and I love that ancient Greek monument. It's beautiful, like Stuart and Revet and others who were passionate about Greece in the 18th century, 19th century. And I can see how Paul Manship would be inspired by that. And I'm trying to think of some parallels. Classicism is still very much with us. And I did get a chance to kind of show more of the decorative program of Rockefeller Center, Lee Lawry's work, for instance. And I think Lee Lawry was somebody who collaborated with Bertram Goodhue, and Goodhue was, in a sense, a modern classicist. So I do think there's a kind of coming together of classicism with sculpture and the decorative arts. Although we don't see as much evidence of it here in New York, there is a kind of diversity. It's a kind of almost a mishmash of sources. And it's not that classicism isn't there. I think it certainly is, but there's so much involved with this so-called Art Deco in terms of this array of, especially what they termed at the time, exotic sources from Africa and pre-Columbian cultures, especially, that maybe some of the classicism that is so wonderful that we're seeing in Manship is getting lost in all of the visual complexity and the visual texture. In the end, they were trying to create a kind of texture, and they would draw on whatever they could to accomplish.
Yeah, it feels, hodgepodge is kind of a negative connotation, but it truly is, I think, a sense of global design that's coming together.
Yes.
That
yes.
might not, that was like seeing the 1925 Art Deco, the Polish room. That was fascinating just to see some of the motifs and patterning there. So thank you.
And if I could jump in, Gail and Erin, if you don't mind, on Erin, to the point of Erin's question and comment, really. Just when you were talking about some of the terminology used, presumably in the plans or master plans, agorae, you have these skyscrapers that are ascending like ziggurats. So that's pre-classical, but the ziggurats, but there is obviously, as there's such a push to modernism, there really is also which I think comes through in Erin's exhibition about Paul Manship, this looking back at different historical styles, but the distant history, and that those histories often get kind of conflated together. When you talk about Babylon, the ziggurat, the agorae, and then these precincts that are designed. I mean, it's almost as though also there's a spirituality that won't be erased by modernism either, and that it builds together with history, which I think Erin shows very nicely in her exhibition and you did in your presentation. So Erin, do you want to ask a few more questions while I have a sip of water?
Sure. Well, there was one question that came in from someone else that I'd love to just ask Gail. Who coined the word skyscraper?
That is a most interesting question. There's a whole history behind that. And lately I was at a conference of people who are interested in technology of the skyscraper who really, are now researching very deeply when the word first appeared. And it apparently, as far as we know, everyone knows, it was in the early 1880s in Chicago, and it was sky-scraper. But it's always been said that skyscraper would refer to something tall. So in the earlier 19th century, it'd be the mast of a ship scraping the sky, or somebody's top hat they'd call. So anything that seemed to reach up into the sky and scrape the sky, they'd say, oh, that was a skyscraper. Again, with the sky-scraper. But by the I'd say by the mid 80s and early 90s, right around then, it starts to become universal. It's everywhere. Certainly by the early 1890s.
Well, we have another question about. Do you think? Well, it's about reception. Do you think there were people in the 1930s who were as appalled by the skyscrapers being constructed at that time as those who are appalled today by super skyscrapers or other probably tall buildings?
It's interesting today around the world, if we look at the global skyscraper, we have just this phenomenal competition for height over in the Middle East, in East Asia, and it's just, whatever, it kind of dazzles the imagination, although I don't know I'm personally that much dazzled by it. But to answer that question, there were critics. There was severe criticism of the skyscraper, not only from architectural critics or the cognoscenti, but people were just uncomfortable with the scale of the building, the masses of the construction, what they did to the streets. And this is the sort of thing that the zoning resolution of 1916 was put in place to remediate in some way, to fix in some way. But I do think that if we did not see skyscrapers like those wonderful towers in Lower Manhattan, Cities Service and the others, or the Empire State or Rockefeller Center in particular. And I want to point out Rockefeller Center in particular, because that project was so concerned with public space, with giving back to the city. If those had not happened, I think the criticism would be much more vociferous. Yeah. So I think that these, part of the theatricality of what we're seeing here was a way of engaging the public. People are on the streets. Now, this is before the age of television. We have radio, and we have journalists, but otherwise, the construction, is as much as it would have congested the streets, as Jana pointed out, nonetheless was exciting to watch. And so the city itself was a kind of theater. You'd go to a Broadway spectacle, but then the idea is you could step out on the city and you could be entertained just as well by the Sky Boy at the top of the Empire State. I mean, they were people loved to watch almost the gymnastics of the workers as they put up these buildings.
Yeah, the labor aspect is completely spectacular, and obviously a huge.
And it's also complex. It's a very on a number of grounds. There's a remarkable diversity in the labor forces. Some, as we know, Native Americans, African Americans, and then this was bound up with issues of unionization. Do you want to keep there's many problematic questions around labor and the skyscraper, but also when we look at Lewis Hine and those photographs we do have a sense of deep respect and devotion and appreciation for those workers, regardless of any other issues for what they were doing in creating the city.
Yeah, and thank you for pointing that out. I know a lot of work has been done on the Mohawk workers who hope to construct the World Trade Center after the World Trade Center collapsed. So we have actually time for one more question. And then I want to thank you profusely, and I'll let Erin wrap up after this last question. Does anyone live in a skyscraper, say above the 80th floor? I don't know if you know the answer to that.
Yes. Do you mean, yes, certainly in the Middle East, they do. There's no question. Those skyscrapers, the Burj Khalifa, for instance, is largely a residential skyscraper. The question may be asking about New York and Chicago. I know that the John Hancock Tower, or John Hancock Center in Chicago, is quite high. And where the apartments stop, I'd have to double check that. But that's fairly high up. I'm not sure if it's above the 80th floor, but it's high. And we know that O'Keeffe, that wasn't the 80th floor either, but she was in the 30th story of a 33-story skyscraper.
Well, thank you, Erin. I don't see you, but I don't know if you wanted to.
I'm here. I'll just say thank you. And on a personal note, I think one of the symbolic things about hearing a lecture in New York is I for one have not been to New York in a year, and or any major city that has I think architecture that's worthy of a second glance. I think going back to the 1920s, there was such mindfulness to the design and stylization of buildings that I sort of have a little entree into through Manship's architectural designs. But Gail, thank you so much. You're just a font of knowledge.
Well, thank you. And as you were speaking, I just thought of a very tall residential skyscraper, 432 Park. It's a sliver skyscraper, a super slender in Manhattan, and that's an apartment skyscraper, and certainly that's above the 80th floor. So.
Ooh. So go check it out, and
yes,
please visit us at the Wadsworth as well when you're re-entering the world and looking for some art and culture. So yeah, thank you again, Gail. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for the opportunity to speak.